The fluorescent lights hummed overhead in the examination room at Misericordia Hospital, as Dr. Raimondo Ostrowski leaned closer, his pen hovering motionless above his notepad. Before him, on the pale exposed skin of Stefan Michalak's chest, was something that defied his decades of medical training. A pattern tower. Precise. Geometric. Maven. Deliberate. Not nearly on toll. 45 circular burns arranged in a perfect grid. Each mark was approximately half an inch in diameter, seared into the flesh with surgical precision. The pattern formed rows, evenly spaced, as if measured by an instrument rather than created by accident. Dr. Ostrowski had treated industrial burns, chemical exposure, radiation injuries. He had seen what fire and heat could do to human tissue. But this was different. This was impossibly organized. The burns weren't scattered randomly like sparks from a welding accident. They weren't irregular like a chemical splash. They were positioned with mathematical accuracy, forming a rectangular array that looked almost manufactured, as if something mechanical had pressed against Stefan's body with calculated force. The skin around each circular mark was raised, inflamed, weeping. Fresh. These wounds were hours old, not days. What kind of heat source creates a pattern like this? What device, what tool, what natural phenomenon could possibly burn flesh in such an orderly arrangement? Dr. Ostrowski documented every detail, photographed the wounds from multiple angles, took measurements. He knew these images would circulate among specialists, passed from hand to hand in medical circles for years to come. He knew no one would have an answer. This wasn't folklore whispered around campfires. This wasn't a dubious story third-hand from a friend of a friend. This was documented medical evidence, preserved in hospital records, photographed under clinical lighting, examined by trained physicians who signed their names to what they witnessed. Stefan Michalak's burns existed in the physical world, measured in centimeters, cataloged in medical files. And 50 years later, no one has explained them. There are men who seem forged from the bedrock they walk upon, solid and practical, their hands stained with the honest work of industry and earth. Stefan Michalak was such a man. In May of 1967, he was 51 years old, a Polish immigrant who had built a life in Winnipeg through the kind of stubborn determination that characterized an entire generation of newcomers to Canada. His days were spent as an industrial mechanic, his hands intimate with the language of metal and machinery, understanding the way things fit together, the way systems worked. These were not the hands of a dreamer or a fantasist. His son Stan would later remember his father with a mixture of respect and affection, painting a portrait of a man defined by his practicality. Stefan was meticulous to a fault, the kind of person who measured twice and cut once, who kept detailed records, who approached problems with methodical patience. He was a man who dealt in observable facts, in things you could touch and weigh and test. There was no room for whimsy in the world Stefan Michalak inhabited. When he told you something, you could take it to the bank. But Stefan harbored one passion that lifted him beyond the grinding routine of factory floors and mechanical systems. He was an amateur geologist, self-taught and devoted, spending whatever free time he could carve from his work schedule tramping through the wilderness of Manitoba in search of minerals and ore samples. This wasn't a casual hobby. Stefan studied geology with the same intensity he brought to his mechanical work, building a respectable knowledge of mineral formations, rock types, and then the telltale signs of promising deposits. He knew what quartz looked like when it caught the light just so. He understood the difference between fool's gold and the real thing. He could read the earth like other men read newspapers. The wilderness around Falcon Lake had become his cathedral. Located about 90 miles east of Winnipeg, right near the Ontario border, Falcon Lake sat nestled in the Canadian Shield, that ancient expanse of Precambrian rock that forms the geological foundation of much of Canada. The area was rich with mineral possibilities, veined with quartz and other formations that made Stefan's prospecting heart beat faster. The Shield was old, truly old, some of the most ancient exposed rock on Earth, and Stefan felt that age when he walked among the granite outcroppings and pine forests. On May 20th, 1967, Stefan set out for Falcon Lake on what he anticipated would be a routine, prospecting trip. It was a Saturday, the spring weather finally warming into something approaching comfortable after the long Manitoba winter. The The forests were alive with new growth, the smell of pine sap thick in the air, the ground soft with moss and needles accumulated over countless seasons. This was the kind of trip Stefan made regularly, so common it barely warranted special mention to his family. He packed his usual gear, the tools of his amateur trade, a geologist's hammer, sample bags, his notebook for recording finds and observations, basic camping supplies. The wilderness Stefan entered that morning was the kind that still existed in relative abundance in Canada, especially in those years before development crept into every corner. Dense stands of spruce and pine created a canopy that filtered the sunlight into shifting patterns on the forest floor. Granite outcroppings jutted from the earth like the bones of the world breaking through skin. Lakes and streams threaded through the landscape, their water clear and cold, tasting of minerals and stone. The air itself felt different here, cleaner somehow, carrying the scent of living wood and ancient rock. Stefan was comfortable in this environment. He understood its rhythms and respected its power. Years of weekend expeditions had taught him how to read the land, where to look for promising formations, how to move safely through terrain that could be unforgiving to the careless. He was not a man who took unnecessary risks. Everything about his approach to prospecting reflected his mechanical mindset: careful observation, systematic exploration, detailed record-keeping. When Stefan found a promising site, he would work it thoroughly, documenting everything, taking proper samples, noting the geological context. The particular area he chose to explore that day was near one of the many rocky ridges that characterized the region. These formations were exactly the kind of place where interesting minerals might be found, where the ancient processes of the Earth's formation had pushed different elements together in potentially valuable combinations. Stefan had been to the general area before, but the wilderness was vast enough that each trip could yield new discoveries. That was part of the appeal, the sense that you might stumble upon something remarkable, some vein of ore or unusual mineral formation that others had missed. Stefan Michalak would later emphasize to anyone who would listen that his father was not a drinker, not a man given to flights of fancy or exaggeration. Stefan's relationship with truth was straightforward. He reported what he saw, what he could verify, what made sense within the framework of his understanding of how the world worked. If anything, he was skeptical of claims that couldn't be backed up with evidence. This was a man who trusted his eyes, his hands, his ability to measure and assess the physical world around him. The supernatural held no interest for him. UFOs and flying saucers belonged to science fiction magazines and television programs, not to serious consideration. His English was functional but accented, his education practical rather than academic. Yet Stefan possessed the kind of intelligence that shows itself in competence rather than eloquence. He could diagnose a failing engine by sound, identify a mineral by its crystalline structure, navigate through dense forest by reading the landscape. These were real skills, applicable skills, the kind that kept machines running and put food on tables. Stefan had no patience for nonsense, no time for stories that couldn't withstand scrutiny. On that May morning, as Stefan made his way deeper into the wilderness around Falcon Lake, he was simply doing what he had done dozens of times before. The sun climbed higher, warming the rocks, drawing out the scent of pine resin. Birds called from the treetops, their songs echoing in the quiet spaces between the trees. A light breeze moved through the forest, just enough to stir the branches and create that susurrus of needles that forms the background music of northern wilderness. Everything was perfectly, wonderfully ordinary. Stefan found a promising outcropping and began his methodical examination, his practiced eye scanning the rock face for signs of interesting formations. This was the work he loved, the patient search for what the earth might reveal. Time passed easily here, measured not by clocks, but by the sun's movement across the sky and the slow accumulation of rock samples in his bag. There was a meditative quality to this kind of prospecting, a focused attention that pushed away the noise and complications of regular life. He was, by every measure that mattered, the last person you would expect to become entangled in one of the most documented and perplexing UFO encounters in Canadian history. A practical mechanic, a careful amateur geologist, a man who dealt in facts and evidence, whose word his own son would vouch for without hesitation. Stefan Michalak had built a life on reliability, on showing up and doing the work, on telling the truth as he understood it. Whatever was about to happen in that quiet Canadian forest would test that reputation in ways he could never have imagined. The evening of January 9, 1965, arrived with a peculiar stillness over Brands Flat, Virginia. Stefan Michalak had spent the day exactly as he had planned during his vacation, wandering through the wilderness near Falcon Lake, searching for quartz deposits and silver veins that might lie hidden in the Canadian shield rock formations. He had traveled here from Winnipeg specifically for this purpose, combining his love of prospecting with a much-needed break from his work as an industrial mechanic. The spring air still carried winter's bite, but Stefan found comfort in the solitude, in the methodical work of examining rock faces and taking careful notes in his journal. As the afternoon shadows began to lengthen, somewhere around 12:30 in the afternoon, Stefan's attention was drawn upward by a peculiar sight that would forever alter the trajectory of his life. Two glowing objects descended through the clear sky, moving with a precision and purpose that immediately captured his complete attention. They were oblong in shape, their surfaces radiating a red glow that seemed almost alive against the pale blue backdrop of the Canadian sky. Stefan stopped his work entirely, his geological hammer hanging loose in his hand as he watched these strange craft descend with what appeared to be controlled, deliberate movement. His first thought, the one that came to him with the comfortable certainty of rational explanation, was that he was witnessing some kind of experimental aircraft. The year 1965 sat squarely in the middle of the Cold War, and Stefan knew, as most people did in that era, that both American and Soviet engineers were pushing the boundaries of aviation technology. Secret test flights happened. New designs were constantly being developed. The United States Air Force had bases scattered across North America, and it wasn't entirely unreasonable to think that some classified vehicle might be undergoing trials in the remote wilderness, where few witnesses would complicate the mission. This explanation satisfied Stefan's mind so completely that fear never entered the equation. Instead, curiosity took hold, that particular brand of curiosity that had always defined his character. He was a man who approached problems directly, who believed in offering assistance when others might need help, who valued practical action over fearful speculation. If this was indeed a military test flight, and if something had gone wrong, perhaps these pilots needed assistance. Perhaps they had been forced to land due to mechanical difficulties. Stefan made a decision in that moment that would seem either remarkably brave or extraordinarily foolish depending on one's perspective. He would approach the craft. One of the two objects veered away, ascending back into the sky with the same controlled movement that had characterized its descent. But the second craft continued downward, settling onto a large flat rock outcropping approximately 160 feet from where Stefan stood. The distance was close enough for detailed observation, but far enough to provide him with what felt like a safe margin. He watched as the craft landed, and even in that moment of landing, nothing in Stefan's mind suggested he should run. Everything about his demeanor, his choices, his thoughts remained grounded in that strange normalcy that would later seem almost incomprehensible to investigators and journalists alike. Stefan reached for his notebook, the same one he had been using to document geological formations and potential mineral deposits. With the practiced hand of someone accustomed to technical drawing from his work as a mechanic, he began to sketch what he saw. The craft measured approximately 35 to 40 feet in diameter, he estimated, with a dome-like structure rising from its center. The exterior surface possessed an extraordinary quality that Stefan struggled to capture in his rough pencil drawings. It appeared to be constructed of something resembling colored glass, though glass seemed too mundane a term for the material. The surface seemed to shift and shimmer, reflecting light in ways that suggested either extreme heat or some property of the material itself that Stefan had never encountered in his years working with metal and machinery. He noted the colors carefully. Reds and purples predominated, but they weren't static hues. They moved across the surface like oil on water, like the aurora borealis compressed into solid form. The craft emitted sounds, too, a detail that Stefan recorded in his notes with as much precision as he could manage. There was a whirring quality, mechanical in nature, which further reinforced his belief that this was a human-made vehicle. Machinery made noise. Engines created vibrations. These were familiar concepts to a man who had spent years around industrial equipment. As Stefan watched and sketched, he became aware of heat. A wave of hot air rolled outward from the craft, strong enough that he could feel it even at his distance. The smell that came with it was unusual, something like sulfur mixed with heated metal, acrid and sharp in his nostrils. Still, Stefan remained calm. Experimental propulsion systems might produce unusual byproducts. Rocket fuel burned hot and produced strange odors. Everything still fit within the framework of his original hypothesis. Time passed. Stefan wasn't sure exactly how long he stood there, sketching and observing, but it felt like approximately 30 minutes. The craft sat silent on the rock, and Stefan found himself growing bolder. He moved closer, reducing the distance between himself and the object to perhaps 90 feet. At this range, he could see more details. The surface texture became more apparent, and he could detect what appeared to be a grid pattern or paneling on the exterior. There were no visible seams in the traditional sense, no bolts or rivets that he could discern, but there were divisions in the surface that suggested construction rather than a single molded piece. Then, something changed. An opening appeared in the side of the craft, a doorway or portal that revealed a brilliant purple light emanating from within. Stefan's heart rate increased, not from fear, but from excitement and a growing sense of purpose. This confirmed it. This was indeed a vehicle with an interior, with occupants who had opened a door. Surely, they had seen him standing there. Surely they were aware of his presence. Perhaps they needed help. Perhaps they were about to make contact. Stefan made another decision, one that would seem almost absurd in retrospect, but which made perfect sense to him in that moment. He called out, in English first, his voice carrying across the rocky terrain with the assumption that American test pilots would understand him. He offered assistance. He asked if they needed help. When no response came, he tried other languages. His Russian was functional, learned during his youth in Europe before immigrating to Canada. He called out in that tongue as well, considering the possibility that this might be a Soviet craft, though that seemed less likely given the geography. Still, no response came from the opening in the craft. The purple light continued to pour from the aperture, and Stefan could now hear voices. This detail excited him tremendously. Voices meant people. Voices meant communication was possible. The sounds were muffled, indistinct, but they had a conversational quality that suggested multiple occupants discussing something among themselves. Stefan strained to catch words, to identify the language being spoken, but the distance and the peculiar acoustic properties of the situation made it impossible. The voices had a strange quality, something he couldn't quite define, but he attributed this to the craft's interior and perhaps to unusual radio equipment or communication devices. Stefan moved closer still, now approaching to within about 60 feet of the craft. He could feel the heat more intensely here, and the smell had grown stronger, that acrid metallic sulfur scent that made his eyes water slightly. The ground beneath the craft appeared undisturbed, he noted. The rock showed no signs of scorching, despite the obvious heat, which struck him as unusual, but not impossible. Perhaps the heat was directional, controlled in some way that prevented damage to the landing surface. As he stood there, notebook in hand, sketching additional details and making written observations, Stefan experienced what might be called a moment of strange normalcy. Everything about this situation had become normalized in his mind. He was watching what he believed to be a military test vehicle. The occupants were conducting some kind of procedure or maintenance. Perhaps they were calibrating equipment. Perhaps they were taking readings or measurements. His presence seemed neither threatening to them nor threatened by them. It was, in his mind, simply an unusual encounter that would make for an interesting story when he returned home to Winnipeg. The sounds from inside the craft continued, those muffled voices discussing unknown matters in their unknown language. Stefan called out again, this time louder, announcing his presence more forcefully and reiterating his offer of assistance. Surely they could hear him. Surely they were aware that a civilian had stumbled upon their operation. But still no direct response came. No figure appeared in the opening, no voice addressed him directly. The heat continued to radiate outward in waves, and Stefan found himself sweating despite the cool spring air. He removed his jacket, draping it over a nearby rock, and continued his observations. The craft remained stationary, that purple light still glowing from the open portal, and Stefan began to notice additional detail. There appeared to be multiple layers to the exterior surface, as though one translucent or semi-transparent material overlay another. The colors shifted not just across the surface, but seemed to emanate from within the structure itself, as though the craft were lit from inside by sources that showed through the walls. It was beautiful in its way. Strange and unprecedented in Stefan's experience, but beautiful nonetheless. The engineer in him appreciated the apparent sophistication of the design, even as he struggled to understand the principles behind it. What material could possess such properties? What propulsion system could generate such heat without visible exhaust? What purpose did the colored glass-like exterior serve? These questions circled through Stefan's mind as he stood there in the wilderness, alone with this extraordinary machine, still operating under the assumption that he was witnessing advanced but fundamentally human technology. The tension built not through fear, but through curiosity, and a growing sense that he was on the edge of understanding something significant. He didn't know, couldn't have known in those moments, that he stood at the threshold of an experience that would defy every rational explanation he had constructed. The forest was doing what forests do on spring mornings, cycling through its quiet rhythms of birdsong and rustling leaves, when everything changed for Stefan Michalak in the span of a single heartbeat. One moment he was standing there, geology hammer in hand, examining the rocky outcroppings near Falcon Lake. The next moment, the craft that had been sitting motionless on the flat granite in front of him began to move. There was no warning, no buildup of sound, no gradual increase in the humming that had been emanating from the strange metallic object since it landed. The craft simply lifted. Not high, perhaps only a few feet, but enough that Stefan's perspective shifted, enough that what had been level with his chest was now angled. And then it began to rotate. Stefan would later try to explain this rotation to investigators, to doctors, to anyone who would listen. It wasn't a wild spinning. It was controlled, deliberate, as if the craft was adjusting its position with precision. The panel he'd been examining, the one with the grid of holes, arranged in a pattern that seemed almost decorative, was now pointing away from him. He should have felt relief. He should have stepped back. But there wasn't time. The rotation brought another panel into alignment with his body. This one had a different configuration of openings, darker somehow, more purposeful. And from these openings came the heat. It hit him like a physical blow, not gradually warming but instantly searing, a concentrated blast of superheated air and something else, something that felt electrical and wrong, something that carried with it the metallic tang of ozone mixed with burning. The exhaust, if that's what it was, struck him directly in the center of his chest, penetrating through the fabric of his shirt as if the cotton weave offered no protection at all. The pain was immediate and absolute. Stefan's nervous system, that intricate network of signals and responses that usually worked so efficiently, seemed to short-circuit all at once. This wasn't like touching something hot and jerking your hand away. This was heat being driven into his body, through his skin, into the tissue beneath. His chest felt like it was being branded from the inside out. He staggered backward, finally moving, finally reacting, but his boot caught on the uneven rock surface. His arms windmilled for balance as the craft continued its rotation, the blast moving across his torso as the object turned. The smell hit him then, cutting through even the shock and pain. It was the smell of his shirt burning, synthetic fibers and cotton melding and melting, creating an acrid stench that filled his nostrils. But underneath that chemical odor was something worse, something organic and terrible. The smell of his own flesh cooking. His stomach lurched. The world tilted, though whether that was from the movement of the craft ascending or his own equilibrium failing, Stefan couldn't tell. The craft lifted higher now, maybe 10 feet, maybe 20. It was hard to judge. The apertures that had blasted him were still visible, still glowing with residual heat that created wavering distortions in the air. And then, with a sound like rushing wind, the craft shot upward and was gone, disappearing into the morning sky so quickly that Stefan's eyes couldn't track it. He stood there, alone again in the forest, but everything was different now. The pain in his chest was intensifying rather than fading, a deep burning that seemed to be working its way deeper into his body with each passing second. His hands moved automatically to his chest, fingers probing at the shirt that was now stuck to his skin in places, the fabric fused by heat into something that was no longer quite cloth. The nausea hit him in a wave, Stefan turned and vomited into the bushes, his body convulsing, trying to expel something that couldn't be expelled because it wasn't in his stomach. It was in his blood, in his cells, in the very structure of his tissue. When the retching finally stopped, he tried to stand fully upright and found he couldn't. The pain in his chest made breathing difficult, each inhalation a fresh experience of agony as his ribs expanded and contracted. He had to get back. That single thought cut through the confusion and pain and shock. He had to get back to the motel, back to civilization, back to his wife. The Falcon Beach Resort was 200 yards away through the bush. 200 yards he'd walked casually that morning, eager to begin his prospecting work. Now those 200 yards seemed impossible. Stefan started walking. Each step sent jolts through his chest as his body moved. The headache was starting now, building behind his eyes with a pressure that felt like his skull was being compressed in a vice. The forest around him, which had seemed so beautiful and full of promise earlier, now felt hostile and endless. Trees that had been landmarks became obstacles. The uneven ground that had been merely something to navigate became a series of potential disasters. He vomited again, stumbling to his knees on the forest floor, hands braced against the cool earth. Nothing came up this time except bile, yellow and bitter, leaving that metallic taste coating his mouth and throat. The taste reminded him of the smell from the craft, that electrical burning odor, and the association made him gag again. Time became strange. Stefan knew the walk back shouldn't take more than 10 or 15 minutes, even moving slowly. But it felt like hours were passing. The sun moved overhead, or seemed to. Shadows shifted. His vision was starting to blur at the edges, a darkness creeping in from his peripheral vision that would recede when he blinked hard, but always came back. His thoughts were fragmenting. He'd be focused on putting one foot in front of the other, and then suddenly he'd realize he was standing still, swaying slightly, with no memory of stopping. The rational part of his mind, the part trained in engineering and mineralogy, tried to catalog his symptoms. Nausea. No. Severe headache. Vision problems. Chest pain and burns. Possible radiation exposure. That last thought should have terrified him, but he was too far into the shock for terror. There was only the need to keep moving. When he finally broke through the tree line and saw the motel, relief flooded through him with such force that his knees nearly buckled. But the ordeal wasn't over. He still had to cross the parking lot, still had to climb the stairs to his room. Each step on those concrete stairs sent fresh waves of pain radiating from his chest. The railing was cool under his hand, solid and real, and he clung to it like a lifeline. The door to the motel room was locked. Of course it was locked. Stefan fumbled for his key, his hands shaking so badly it took 3 tries to get it in the lock. When the door finally opened and he stumbled inside, his wife looked up from the book she'd been reading, and her expression transformed instantly from casual interest to absolute horror. She was across the room in seconds, hands reaching for him, voice asking questions he couldn't quite process through the ringing in his ears. Stefan tried to speak, tried to explain, but the words wouldn't come out in the right order. Instead, he just gestured weakly at his chest and said something about the craft, about being burned. His wife's hands moved to the buttons of his shirt, but Stefan grabbed her wrists. Even through the fog of pain and disorientation, he knew that removing the shirt was going to be excruciating. The fabric was stuck to his skin, but it had to come off. They needed to see the damage. Together, slowly, carefully, they began the process. In some places, the shirt came away easily. In others, it pulled at the burned skin beneath, and Stefan had to bite down on his lip to keep from crying out. The metallic taste in his mouth intensified, and he wondered distantly if he'd bitten through the lip, or if this was another symptom of whatever had happened to him. When the shirt finally came away completely, they both stared in silence at what was revealed. Stefan's chest was marked with a pattern. Not random burns scattered across the skin, but a deliberate arrangement. The burns formed a grid, a configuration of dots and lines that corresponded exactly to the arrangement of the apertures on that panel of the craft. The holes had projected their pattern onto his flesh, burning it into him like a brand, like a mark, like proof. The burns themselves were severe. The skin reddened and blistered in some areas, charred and blackened in others. The pattern covered an area roughly 9 inches by 6 inches across the center of his chest. His wife's hand moved toward the injuries, then pulled back, afraid to touch, afraid to cause more pain. The nausea surged again, and Stefan barely made it to the bathroom before vomiting once more. He knelt on the cool tile, forehead pressed against the porcelain, and felt his wife's hand on his shoulder. The headache was a constant presence now, a crushing pressure that made it hard to think, hard to remember, hard to do anything except exist in this moment of suffering. Time continued its strange elasticity. Minutes might have passed or hours. Eventually, they decided medical attention was necessary. Not eventually. Immediately. But Stefan's thoughts were so scattered, his ability to make decisions so compromised, that what should have been an immediate emergency response became a slow, confused discussion that took far too long. The pattern on his chest would remain. Even after the doctors examined him, after the treatments began, after the initial shock faded into the long recovery ahead, the pattern would stay. A permanent reminder burned into his flesh of the moment when something impossible became undeniably, agonizingly real. Stefan Michalak returned to Winnipeg a changed man, though the full extent of that change wouldn't become clear for days. The bizarre encounter at Falcon Lake had ended with him stumbling away from the landed craft, his chest burning beneath his shirt, his head pounding with a pressure he'd never experienced before. He'd made it back to his motel, cleaned himself up as best he could, and caught a bus home. But something was deeply, profoundly wrong. His wife Irene knew it the moment she saw him. Stefan's face had taken on an ashen quality, a grayish pallor that spoke of something more than exhaustion. When he lifted his shirt to show her what had happened, she gasped. There, emblazoned across his chest and abdomen, was a pattern that would baffle medical professionals for weeks to come. A grid of circular burn marks, perfectly arranged in geometric precision. The burns formed a distinct pattern of dots, each one roughly the size of a coin, laid out with mathematical exactness. This wasn't the random scarring you'd expect from a fire or an explosion. This was something else entirely, something that looked deliberately applied, as if burned into his skin by some precisely controlled mechanism. Within hours of arriving home, Stefan's condition deteriorated rapidly. The nausea that had plagued him during the bus ride intensified. He vomited repeatedly, unable to keep down even water. His head throbbed with an intensity that made thinking difficult, speaking painful. By the next morning, he could barely stand without assistance. Irene, growing increasingly alarmed, insisted they go to the Misericordia Hospital emergency room. The emergency room doctor that Sunday evening examined Stefan with growing concern. The burn pattern was unlike anything in his experience. First-degree burns, certainly, but the arrangement, the geometric precision of the circular dots, defied any conventional explanation. When Stefan recounted his story, the doctor's expression shifted from concern to skepticism, then back to concern as he studied the physical evidence before him. Whatever had caused these burns, it had done so with extraordinary precision. The doctor treated the burns as best he could, applied ointments, prescribed pain medication, and sent Stefan home with instructions to return if his condition worsened. It worsened. Over the following days, Stefan's symptoms multiplied in ways that painted an increasingly disturbing picture. His weight began dropping at an alarming rate. In just the first week, he lost 17 pounds, his frame growing gaunt, his cheekbones becoming prominent in his increasingly hollow face. The nausea never fully subsided. Food had no appeal. When he did manage to eat, his body often rejected it within the hour. Sleep brought little relief. He would wake in the night, drenched in sweat, the burn pattern on his chest throbbing with a deep, penetrating pain that seemed to emanate from within his body, rather than from the surface wound. The smell persisted too. That sulfurous, metallic odor that had enveloped him at the landing site clung to his clothes, his skin, his hair. No amount of washing seemed to completely eliminate it. Irene would catch whiffs of it when she came near him, a sharp chemical stench that made her nostrils flare and her eyes water. It was in the clothing he'd worn that day, permeating the fabric so thoroughly that ordinary laundering couldn't touch it. By the end of that first week, it became clear that this was beyond the scope of a single emergency room visit. Stefan embarked on what would become an odyssey through the medical establishment, a weeks-long journey from specialist to specialist, hospital to hospital, each doctor more puzzled than the last. He returned to Misericordia Hospital multiple times. He was examined at Winnipeg General, He consulted with dermatologists, radiation specialists, internal medicine experts. Each examination followed a similar pattern. Initial skepticism at his story, followed by profound confusion when confronted with the physical evidence. The burn pattern remained the most visible and most baffling evidence. Doctors would study it, measure it, photograph it. The circular dots, arranged in their perfect grid, showed none of the characteristics of conventional burns. There was no splash pattern, no irregular edges, no indication of contact with a heated surface. Some doctors suggested chemical burns, but chemical burns don't arrange themselves in geometric patterns. Others proposed some kind of industrial accident, but Stefan's work as an amateur geologist provided no exposure to machinery or chemicals that could produce such marks. And none of these conventional explanations addressed the pattern's precision, the deliberate quality of its arrangement. As the medical documentation accumulated, another alarming trend emerged in Stefan's blood work. His lymphocyte count had dropped significantly. Lymphocytes, the white blood cells crucial to immune function, were declining at a rate that concerned every doctor who reviewed his charts. This wasn't a minor fluctuation. This was a substantial, measurable decline that indicated something serious happening at a cellular level. When combined with his other symptoms, the weight loss, the persistent nausea, the fatigue that left him barely able to function, a disturbing picture began to emerge. Several doctors began to suspect radiation exposure. The symptoms aligned too closely to dismiss. The burn pattern, while unusual in its geometry, was consistent with a localized radiation burn. The lymphocyte drop was a classic marker of radiation exposure, one of the body's most reliable indicators that it had been subjected to ionizing radiation. The nausea, the vomiting, the profound fatigue, all fit the profile of someone who'd received a significant dose. But radiation from what? From where? Stefan's story of a flying saucer seemed impossible, but the physical evidence demanded explanation. This is where the case took a turn that would remove it from the realm of pure speculation and ground it in documented, verifiable fact. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police had become involved, not because they believed Stefan's story necessarily, but because his report and condition warranted investigation. Officers collected his clothing, the shirt he'd been wearing, the pants, the gloves. These items, still carrying that persistent sulfurous smell, were sent to the Whiteshell Nuclear Research Establishment, a government facility equipped to analyze potential radioactive contamination. The results came back positive. The Whiteshell Nuclear Research Establishment found radioactive contamination on Stefan's clothing. Not background levels. Not trace amounts that could be explained by ordinary environmental exposure. Measurable, significant radioactive contamination, concentrated particularly on the shirt, right where it had been against his burned chest. The facility documented their findings. This wasn't hearsay or speculation. This was scientific analysis conducted by a government nuclear research establishment, and it confirmed that Stefan Michalak had been exposed to radioactive material. The revelation should have settled matters, should have provided the key to understanding what had happened, but instead, it deepened the mystery. Because while the contamination was real, measurable, documented, no one could explain how Stefan had been exposed to it. There were no nuclear facilities in the Falcon Lake area, no medical radiation equipment, no industrial sources of radioactive material. The region was wilderness, pristine Canadian Shield country where the most advanced technology was typically camping equipment. What could possibly have exposed him to radiation out there? The conflict between physical evidence and medical possibility became the defining characteristic of Stefan's case. On one hand, the evidence was undeniable. The burns were real. The weight loss was documented. The lymphocyte drop was measured repeatedly, confirmed by multiple labs. The radioactive contamination was verified by a government nuclear facility. These were facts, recorded in medical charts and laboratory reports. On the other hand, none of it should have been possible. There was no conventional explanation that could account for all the evidence simultaneously. Doctors struggled with this contradiction. In their examination notes, you can read the frustration, the bewilderment. They would document the physical findings with clinical precision, then struggle to provide a diagnosis, an explanation, any framework that made sense of what they were seeing. Some suspected malingering, that Stefan had somehow fabricated the evidence, but how does one fake a lymphocyte drop? How does one apply radioactive contamination to clothing in a pattern consistent with exposure? The more they looked for conventional explanations, the more those explanations failed to account for the totality of the evidence. Stefan's reputation complicated matters further. He was known in Winnipeg as a serious, credible man. An industrial mechanic by trade, he had no history of attention-seeking or fabrication. His hobby was geology, a pursuit that spoke to careful observation and scientific thinking. Friends and coworkers described him as level-headed, practical, not given to flights of fancy. When such a man presents with documented physical trauma and claims an extraordinary cause, what is the medical establishment to do? Dismiss the cause and treat the symptoms? But how do you treat symptoms when you don't understand their origin? News of the case spread through medical circles. A man presenting with apparent radiation burns and documented radioactive contamination, claiming exposure from an unidentified flying craft, was too unusual to ignore. It reached Dr. Horace Dudley at the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota, one of the most prestigious medical institutions in North America. Now, the Mayo Clinic had resources and expertise beyond what was available in Winnipeg. If anyone could unravel this medical mystery, it would be their specialists. Stefan made the journey to Rochester, likely hoping that the renowned doctors at Mayo would provide answers where others had found only questions. Dudley conducted a thorough examination. He reviewed all the medical documentation from Winnipeg, the lab results, the photographs of the burn pattern. He examined Stefan directly, interviewing him about the incident, documenting his current symptoms, ordering additional tests. The Mayo Clinic brought its considerable resources to bear on this single, baffling case. Dr. Dudley's conclusion, when it came, was as unsettling as it was honest. The case was medically inexplicable. He could confirm the burns, document their unusual pattern, verify the continued presence of symptoms consistent with radiation exposure. He could see the weight loss, measure it, document the ongoing health effect, but he could not explain them through any conventional medical framework. The geometric precision of the burns defied standard explanations. The radioactive contamination was verified but sourceless. The symptom constellation fit radiation exposure, but from what source, delivered how? This was perhaps the most significant aspect of Dr. Dudley's involvement. This wasn't a rural doctor out of his depth or a general practitioner lacking specialized knowledge. This was a physician at one of the world's leading medical institutions, with access to cutting-edge diagnostic tools and the collective expertise of numerous specialists, stating for the record that he could not explain what had happened to Stefan Michalak. The case resided in that uncomfortable space where documented physical evidence collides with the boundaries of accepted medical possibility. Stefan's odyssey through the medical system continued for weeks, then months. Each doctor added another piece to the puzzle, another documented symptom, another confirmed finding, but no one could assemble these pieces into a picture that made conventional sense. The burns slowly healed, leaving pale circular scars in their perfect geometric arrangement, a permanent reminder emblazoned on his skin. His weight stabilized eventually, though he never fully recovered the pounds lost in those first terrible weeks. The lymphocyte count gradually improved, his immune system slowly rebuilding itself from whatever had depleted it. But answers remained elusive. The medical documentation grew thicker, a file of clinical observations and test results that described without explaining, that measured without understanding. Stefan was left with scars, both visible and internal, from an experience that straddled the line between the documented and the impossible, leaving doctors and skeptics alike unable to provide a satisfying explanation that accounted for all the evidence. The morning after Stefan Michalak stumbled into the Misericordia Hospital, claiming he'd been burned by a UFO in the wilderness, something unusual happened. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police didn't dismiss his story. They didn't laugh it off as the ravings of a confused prospector, or the tall tale of a man who'd spent too long in the sun. Instead, they listened, and more importantly, they decided to investigate. Within days of Stefan's encounter on May 20, 1967, the RCMP organized an expedition back to Falcon Lake. Stefan, despite his injuries and the nausea that still plagued him, agreed to guide them. He wanted them to see it. He needed someone else to witness what he'd witnessed, even if the craft itself was long gone. The burn on his chest throbbed beneath his shirt as they made their way through the dense Ontario wilderness, retracing the path he'd taken just days before. The forest looked different in the company of uniformed officers. Less mysterious perhaps, but no less vast. Stefan led them through the thick brush, past the granite outcroppings and stands of birch and pine, toward the clearing where his life had changed forever. He'd marked the spot in his memory, every tree and stone etched into his mind with the clarity that trauma brings. When they arrived at the site, Stefan stopped. His hand gestured toward a section of the forest floor, and the officers moved forward to examine it. What they found would be documented in official reports, photographed and analyzed. What they found would become part of the permanent record, a puzzle that would frustrate investigators for decades to come. The ground told a story. In a circular area approximately 15 feet in diameter, the vegetation had been disturbed in a pattern that defied easy explanation. The moss and small plants that carpeted the forest floor showed signs of having been compressed and scorched. But this wasn't the random damage of a forest fire or the scattered impact of lightning. This was geometric, deliberate. The pattern formed a near-perfect circle, as if something large and round had pressed down upon the earth with considerable force. The RCMP officers photographed the site from multiple angles. They took measurements. They made sketches. And they collected samples. Soil from within the circle. Soil from outside it for comparison. Bits of the affected vegetation. Every sample was carefully labeled, cataloged, and prepared for laboratory analysis. This wasn't the cursory investigation of a dismissed claim. This was thorough. This was serious. But it was what they found next that would elevate Stefan's case from curious incident to genuine mystery. One of the officers carried a Geiger counter, standard equipment for certain types of investigations in that era of Cold War anxiety and nuclear testing. When he swept it across the landing site, the device began to click. Not the occasional background radiation click that exists everywhere on Earth, but something more pronounced, something measurable, something that shouldn't have been there in the middle of the Canadian wilderness. The radioactive traces were concentrated in the circular area where the vegetation had been disturbed. The readings weren't dangerously high, but they were definitively above background levels. The officers exchanged glances. Whatever had happened here, it had left a signature that their instruments could detect. Stefan watched their faces as they worked, seeing perhaps the first glimmer of validation. He wasn't crazy. He wasn't lying. Something had been here. The soil samples were sent to laboratories for detailed analysis. When the results came back, they added another layer to the mystery. The mineral composition of the soil within the circle showed anomalies that the analysts couldn't easily explain. Certain elements appeared in concentrations that didn't match the surrounding area. The soil had been changed somehow, altered at a molecular level by whatever had rested upon it. Word of the physical evidence reached other agencies. This was 1967, and Canada had its own UFO investigation program. Project Magnet, initially established in 1950 by the Canadian government to study geomagnetic phenomena and their potential connection to UFO sightings, had officially closed in 1954. But the interest hadn't disappeared. The Canadian Department of National Defence maintained protocols for investigating unusual aerial phenomena, and Stefan's case, with its physical evidence and documented injuries, demanded attention. The Department of National Defense sent their own investigators. They interviewed Stefan multiple times, pressing him for details, testing his story for inconsistencies. They examined the medical records from the Misericordia Hospital and the White Shell Nuclear Research Establishment, where Stefan had sought treatment for radiation exposure. The burn pattern on his chest, that distinctive grid of circular marks, was photographed and analyzed. Medical experts confirmed that the burns were real and unusual in their configuration. The investigators returned to Falcon Lake repeatedly over the following months. They brought more sophisticated equipment. They expanded their search radius, looking for any additional evidence, any clues that might explain what had occurred. They found metal fragments in the vicinity, small pieces that Stefan claimed he'd seen when he approached the craft. These too were collected and analyzed. The metal samples presented yet another puzzle. Metallurgical analysis revealed compositions that, while not impossible to create, were unusual. Some samples showed signs of having been subjected to extreme heat. The question became, what kind of heat? What kind of process? And most frustratingly, why here, in this remote location? As the investigation progressed, something remarkable emerged in the official documentation. The government investigators, despite their thorough work and access to expertise across multiple disciplines, couldn't debunk Stefan's story. They tried. The reports show they genuinely attempted to find conventional explanations. Could the burns have been self-inflicted? The medical evidence suggested not, and Stefan's behavior before and after the incident didn't fit the profile of someone seeking attention through self-harm. Could he have encountered some terrestrial craft, perhaps a military prototype or experimental vehicle? The Department of National Defense checked. No Canadian or known American operations were taking place in that area. Could the radioactive traces and soil anomalies have natural explanations? Geologists and nuclear experts examined the data and found the patterns inconsistent with natural occurrence. The official government files on the Michalak case, documents that would be declassified years later, reveal an investigation conducted with genuine rigor. These weren't dismissive reports written to placate a persistent witness. These were serious analyses that acknowledged the physical evidence as real and significant. The radioactive traces were confirmed by multiple measurements. The soil anomalies were documented by qualified scientists. The burn injuries were verified by medical professionals. And yet, the conclusion in the official reports was that single, frustrating word, unexplained. Not explained, not debunked, not solved. Unexplained. The government acknowledged that something happened to Stefan Michalak at Falcon Lake, that physical evidence supported his account of an encounter with an unknown craft, but they couldn't or wouldn't take the next step of officially confirming what that something was. This contradiction sits at the heart of the Falcon Lake incident. On one side, you have a credible witness with no history of deception or mental illness. You have medical evidence of unusual injuries. You have physical evidence at the landing site, confirmed by multiple investigative bodies. You have radioactive traces and soil anomalies that suggest the presence of something producing significant energy or radiation. You have government documents acknowledging all of this. On the other side, you have silence. The investigation led nowhere in terms of official conclusions. No formal statement was ever made identifying what Stefan encountered. The case file was eventually closed with that maddening designation, unexplained. For Stefan and for those who studied his case, this created a profound frustration. How much evidence was needed? What more could possibly be required to move beyond unexplained to some form of acknowledgement? The investigators packed up their equipment and left Falcon Lake. The soil samples sat in storage facility. The photographs were filed away in government archives. Stefan was left with his memories, his scars, and the knowledge that he'd been believed enough to warrant serious investigation, but not enough for anyone in authority to publicly validate his experience. The landing site itself remained, a circular scar in the forest floor that would persist for years. Locals began visiting it, curious to see the place where something unexplained had occurred. Some reported feeling unusual sensations there, headaches or nausea similar to what Stefan had experienced. Others claimed their compasses behaved strangely in the vicinity. Whether these reports were genuine or psychological responses to knowing the site's history remains another unanswered question. What we're left with is a case that should have been definitive, but instead became emblematic of how physical evidence in UFO cases is handled. The Falcon Lake incident had everything investigators typically claim is lacking in such cases: a reliable witness, immediate medical documentation, physical traces, radioactive evidence, and thorough official investigation. And still, it ended in that bureaucratic limbo of unexplained, a word that satisfies no one and resolves nothing, leaving us to wonder what threshold of proof might ever be sufficient. The pattern on Zygmunt Adamski's body defied every attempt at rational explanation. When forensic investigators first photographed the burns at the mortuary, they documented something that would haunt the career of every expert who examined it. 44 to 48 circular marks, arranged in a grid formation of such geometric precision that it looked machine-made. Each mark measured approximately the same diameter, spaced at identical intervals, forming rows and columns with the exactitude of a technical blueprint. This wasn't the random scatter of impact burns or the irregular spread of chemical exposure. This was deliberate. This was designed. Detective Alan Godfrey stood in the examination room, watching as the pathologist used a ruler to measure the spaces between each circular burn. The measurements came back identical, again and again. 2 centimeters between each mark. The same distance, repeated across the entire grid. The detective had investigated industrial accidents, house fires, electrical malfunctions, and chemical explosions throughout his career. He had seen what burns looked like when transformers exploded, when battery acid spilled, when people fell against hot machinery. None of it looked like this. The pathologist, Dr. David Howarth, had conducted over 3,000 autopsies in his career. He had examined victims of every conceivable manner of death. He photographed the pattern from multiple angles, his camera clicking methodically as he circled the body. Each photograph revealed the same disturbing reality. The burns covered Adamski's neck and shoulders in a pattern so regular it could have been stamped on by a machine press. But the burns went deeper than simple surface damage. The tissue showed evidence of intense, focused heat applied with surgical precision. Dr. Howarth brought in colleagues. A burns specialist from Leeds examined the pattern and stood silent for nearly 10 minutes, simply staring. A forensic pathologist from Manchester who had worked on major disaster investigations took measurements, documented findings, and finally admitted he had never seen anything comparable. They began the process that would stretch across decades, attempting to match the pattern to known sources of thermal damage. The first theory centered on industrial equipment. Yorkshire was mining country, heavy industry territory. Perhaps Adamski had fallen against some piece of machinery, some grating or vent system that left its impression burned into his skin. Investigators visited every coal mine, every factory, every industrial facility within a 100-mile radius of Tingley. They photographed exhaust vents, cooling grates, machinery ports, and industrial screens. They measured the spacing of holes in metal plates, the arrangement of ventilation systems, the patterns of industrial burners. Nothing matched. Not even close. The spacing was wrong, or the diameter was off, or the number of marks didn't align. One factory had a ventilation system with the right spacing, but the holes were too large. A mining facility had circular vents of the right size but arranged in a different geometric pattern. A power station had cooling ports that formed a grid, but with 64 marks instead of 44 to 48. Every comparison failed. Every attempt to find a match in the industrial landscape of 1980 came up empty. Researchers then considered weapons. Could some device have created this pattern? Military experts were consulted, though unofficially. The Ministry of Defense had experimental equipment, non-lethal crowd control devices, directed energy systems in various stages of development. Perhaps Adamski had been the victim of some weapons test gone wrong, some prototype that created thermal damage in a grid pattern. The weapons experts studied the photographs. They measured, calculated, and analyzed. Their conclusion was definitive. No weapon system in the British military arsenal, experimental or operational, created thermal damage like this. Directed energy weapons left different signatures. Microwave systems caused internal heating without external marks. Laser weapons created linear burns or single-point impacts, not geometric grids. The pattern on Adamski's body matched nothing in any database. Natural phenomena became the next avenue of investigation. Ball lightning had been documented creating unusual burns. Electrical discharges from storms could leave strange patterns. Perhaps some rare atmospheric event, some combination of weather conditions and electrical charge, had created this marking. Meteorologists and atmospheric physicists examined the evidence. Ball lightning did create circular marks, but never in regular geometric patterns. Electrical burns from lightning strikes showed fractal branching patterns, not organized grids. St. Elmo's fire created glowing effects but left no thermal damage. Every natural phenomenon they considered operated through processes that produced random or organic patterns. Nature did not work in precise geometric formations with measurements accurate to the millimeter. The most disturbing aspect emerged when investigators examined Adamski's shirt. The garment he had been wearing when he disappeared showed the same grid pattern burned into the fabric. This detail transformed the mystery from merely unexplained to physically impossible. The burns had appeared on his skin through his shirt, yet the shirt itself also bore the pattern. Whatever had caused these marks had affected both organic tissue and synthetic fabric simultaneously. Forensic textile experts studied the shirt under laboratory conditions. The burn pattern in the fabric aligned exactly with the pattern on his skin. The heat had penetrated the shirt to damage the flesh beneath, while simultaneously creating an identical pattern in the fabric itself. This violated fundamental principles of heat transfer and energy absorption. When heat burns through fabric to reach skin, the fabric shows greater damage than the skin beneath. The material closer to the heat source absorbs more energy. It's basic thermodynamics. But in Adamski's case, both the shirt and skin showed equivalent thermal damage. The energy had somehow affected both materials equally, as if it operated on some property they shared rather than following normal rules of thermal conductivity. Dr. Malcolm Robinson, a researcher who would spend decades investigating the case, conducted experiments attempting to recreate the burn pattern. He used various heat sources, grids of heated metal rods, patterns of focused infrared lamps, arrays of small torches. He applied heat to fabric-covered synthetic skin used in medical training. Every experiment produced the same result. Either the fabric burned more severely than the material beneath, or the heat source left marks that didn't match the geometric precision of Adamski's burns. Robinson tried chemical burns, electromagnetic sources, and focused radiation. He consulted with materials scientists, industrial engineers, and physics professors. They devised increasingly sophisticated experiments using controlled heat sources arranged in precise geometric patterns. None of them could replicate the effect seen on Adamski's body. The simultaneous, equivalent burning of organic and inorganic matter through some unknown mechanism remained beyond their ability to reproduce. In 2006, cold case investigators with access to modern forensic technology reopened the examination. Digital photography allowed for three-dimensional mapping of the burn pattern. Computer analysis measured the spacing and diameter of each mark with unprecedented precision. The results confirmed what earlier investigators had documented. The pattern was geometrically perfect within margins of error smaller than a millimeter. Spectroscopic analysis of the burned tissue revealed another anomaly. The cellular damage showed characteristics of extremely rapid heating, far faster than conventional thermal sources could achieve. The cells had been destroyed almost instantaneously, suggesting exposure to temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees Celsius applied for less than a second. But such rapid, intense heat should have ignited the shirt, caused smoke damage, left scorching beyond the immediate burn sites. None of those secondary effects appeared. Forensic investigators in 2012 conducted comparative analysis using databases that hadn't existed in 1980. They searched for matching patterns in industrial accident reports from around the world. They examined documentation from chemical plants, nuclear facilities, aerospace manufacturers, and military installations. The database included thousands of thermal injury cases from dozens of countries. The search returned no matches. A team from Sheffield Hallam University studied the case in 2014 as part of a forensic science research project. They employed thermal imaging simulation software to model various scenarios that might produce such a pattern. They input parameters for industrial accidents, weapon systems, chemical reactions, and electrical phenomena. The software calculated the thermal distribution, energy requirements, and physical effects of each scenario. Not one simulation produced results matching the evidence from Adamski's body. The researchers concluded that creating such a pattern would require a heat source consisting of 44 to 48 individual elements, each producing identical temperatures, activated simultaneously, and maintained in perfect geometric alignment while in contact with both fabric and skin. Such a device would need to operate on principles that allowed equal energy transfer to materials with vastly different thermal properties. No known technology functioned this way. The physical paradox at the heart of the case remained unresolved. Energy doesn't behave the way it would need to behave to create these burns. Heat follows laws of thermodynamics that are not optional, not variable, not subject to exceptions. Those laws govern the formation of the universe and dictate how energy moves through matter. The burns on Zygmunt Adamski's body appeared to violate those fundamental principles. Dr. Robert Anderson, a physicist consulted on the case in 2018, put it plainly. For the observed effect to occur through conventional physics would require the heat source to somehow bypass normal thermal transfer processes. The energy would need to affect molecular bonds directly in both organic tissue and synthetic polymers, creating identical damage despite the materials having completely different thermal properties, different molecular structures, different energy absorption characteristics. He stated that such an effect wasn't merely unexplained by current science. It was ruled out by established physical law. Modern investigators continue to examine the evidence. The photographs, the measurements, the documented attempts at recreation all remain in case files. The mystery hasn't faded with time. If anything, advances in forensic science have made it more disturbing. Each new analytical technique confirms the precision of the pattern. Each technological advance brings new tools to examine the evidence, and each examination reinforces the same conclusion. This shouldn't exist. The burns on Zygmunt Adamski's body represent something that our understanding of physics says cannot happen. Whatever touched Zygmunt Adamski in those missing days operated by rules we don't understand, using processes we cannot recreate, producing effects that violate the established laws governing how energy and matter interact. The grid pattern burned into his flesh stands as a physical impossibility, documented in photographs and measurements and forensic reports. It remains there, waiting, challenging anyone who examines it to explain what cannot be explained. The evidence sits in storage facilities and medical archives, silent and unchanging. Physical proof that has never been explained away, never been successfully debunked, never faded with the passage of time. Stefan Michalak's story might have been dismissed as fantasy or delusion, except for one undeniable fact. His body bore the marks of something that happened on that May morning in 1967. The burns. Those strange circular burns arranged in a perfect grid pattern across his chest and abdomen. Not random scorch marks, not the chaotic damage of fire or explosion, but precise, geometric circles spaced with mechanical accuracy. Medical professionals photographed them, documented them, studied them. The images remain in archives today. Stark black and white photographs showing a pattern that burns like an afterimage into your mind. What could create such marks? What force passes through fabric, through undershirt and outer clothing, to brand skin with such exactness? His shirt and undershirt still exist, preserved as evidence. The fabric shows the same pattern, holes burned through in those perfect circles. Edges singed with precision that seems almost surgical. Radiation counters passed over this clothing detected contamination. Not the natural background radiation present everywhere, but elevated readings that suggested exposure to something radioactive. And then there is the medical documentation. Stefan suffered documented radiation sickness in the weeks following his encounter. Hair loss, weight loss, swelling, nausea. Doctors recorded his symptoms, treated his condition, filed their reports. This was not a story whispered in the dark. This was a medical case with paperwork, with dates, with physicians' signatures. Soil samples taken from the site showed anomalies. Something had been there, something that left traces in the earth itself. The physical world had been altered, marked, changed by whatever Stefan encountered in that clearing among the birch trees. He died in 1999, an old man carrying scars that never fully healed. 32 years after that May morning, and he never changed his story. Not once. Not under scrutiny, not under skepticism, not when it would have been easier to recant. The burns on his chest remained until the end, faded but visible, a permanent reminder of something that defied explanation. Somewhere in evidence files, those photographs still wait. The burns, documented and preserved, proof of something. But proof of what? That question hangs in the air, unanswered, perhaps unanswerable. The physical evidence exists. The scars were real. The encounter left marks that time could not erase. And we are left holding pieces of a puzzle that refuses to form a complete picture, staring at proof that proves everything and nothing at all. That's where this journey ends for tonight. If you made it all the way here, subscribe and hit the bell for more long-form stories like this. Check out the videos on screen for more right now. Drop your own experiences in the comments below. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.